We're going to take a quick look on migrating phones from enterprise firmware to 3PCC using enterprise firmware 14.1/1. This allows us to actually bypass the transitional firmware, so it yields us actually better performance for the firmware migration process, and also potentially addresses some limitation with the transitional firmware, which I'll talk about in a minute. Please be aware we're still dealing with licensing. So if you're migrating from enterprise firmware to MPP firmware, you still do need licenses for the actual phone. In this case, I'm going to be using WebEx Calling. Specifically in Control Hub, there's a firmware migration function. And using this based upon the MAC address of my phone and also user account that the phone's going to be associated, it's going to generate a virtual license that the phone's going to use for the migration. If I was using this for a deployment which is not WebEx Calling, then I would need to actually purchase licensing for each phone that's going to be migrated from enterprise to MPP. So just be aware, this does make it easier, this process, using 14.1/1 for the migration, but the firmware migration license is still needed. Also, there's a very good document that you can go and see. It's a white paper document related to firmware migrations. It gets updated from time to time. It has actually very good information regarding licensing, compatibility as far as what hardware is eligible for firmware migration, because not all the hardware may be eligible, and any other related information as far as tech support resources and etc. Okay, one of the big benefits of migrating from enterprise firmware 14.1/1 to MPP is it's a single-step process now. So what's happening is we're actually bypassing the transitional firmware load. There's, I would say, two main benefits you may observe. One is the actual speed at which you can do firmware migrations. Theoretically would be cut in half, because instead of going from the enterprise firmware to the transitional firmware and then from a transitional firmware to the 3PCC, also known as the MPP firmware, you're going directly from enterprise to 3PCC. If you have a lot of phones, this can make a big difference. Also, the other benefit of the specific method I'm showing here, since we're using a local TFTP, all the heavy lifting is occurring locally on the LAN. So that's eliminating a lot of the actual binaries needing to be pulled by the individual phones across the WAN, across internet. If you have a site that has limited bandwidth, then that would be another benefit in speeding up the firmware migration, especially if you have a large batch of phones you're trying to migrate. And we talked about this earlier, the firmware migration license is still required. In this case, we're going to be using the virtual firmware migration license within WebEx Calling. So before 14.1/1 enterprise firmware, the firmware migration process required two steps. First step was migration from enterprise firmware to the transitional firmware load. And generally that step was about 5 to 8 minutes on average. And then step number 2, from the transitional firmware load to the MPP firmware load, that would be another 5 to 8 minutes on average. So the total time per each phone was roughly about 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes. That number can get substantially longer if you're doing multiple phones concurrently and your bandwidth is limited on site. So this is where using what we're going to show in this video might be a big benefit, especially if you have a larger batch of phones you're trying to migrate, and also there's limitation as far as your internet access bandwidth capacity. So starting with 14.1/1 firmware and above, the firmware migration only needs one step. So basically we're going directly from enterprise firmware 14.1/1 to MPP, also known as 3PCC. And this is supported starting version 11.3.5, so 11.3.5 of MPP. In this video, I'm going to be actually using 11.3.6 because that's currently what WebEx Calling is using. Because what would happen is if I migrated from 14.1.1 to 11.3.5, that would work. But then when a phone goes and does a handshake with the WebEx Calling server, and once it's in the 3PCC firmware, then I'll go ahead and download the 11.3.6 firmware, and that's going to again consume some additional time and also WAN capacity. So if your goal is to maximize the amount of time that it takes to migrate the phone as far as performance, how do we squeeze down the amount of time it takes you to do a large batch of phones, then the idea would be migrating from 14.1.1 or higher directly to MPP, specifically the MPP version that WebEx Calling is currently using. The other item that can also actually assist with is, since we're bypassing the transitional firmware load, it can help with certain new IP hardware versions of phones where the transitional firmware may not support that specific hardware phone version. So this is an area, if you're running into issues, you have brand new phones, for example 7821, 7841, we'll look at a chart here in a moment. It is possible that the hardware version of those phones is at a version that the older transitional firmware simply does not support that hardware, and if you're running into issues not being able to migrate those types of phones, then this is most likely a key root cause of that issue. And then we talked about this, since we're using a local TFTP, the potential of yielding faster migration time when we have a larger fleet of phones is another benefit of considering using this technique. For some customer sites have a lot of bandwidth capacity, that this may not be an issue, but for a lot of customers, bandwidth capacity may be limited to 50 meg, 100 meg. And if you're going to be doing like 50 or 100 phones concurrently, that can definitely stretch out the firmware migration into a multi-hour process. In most cases, most folks would be limited in the amount of time they have, because typically they're doing a cutover from on-premise to cloud, and typically it needs to happen overnight or has to happen over a weekend. So the timing is very, very tight. Again, this can yield better performance in the firmware migration process as far as how much time you can squeeze the migration down to. And then definitely want to take a look at the release notes. So at the time you're watching this video, whatever is the current release of the firmware, you want to go ahead and take a look at the release notes to understand if there's any new types of caveats or new techniques for the firmware migration. Okay, I mentioned a few moments ago that if you have newer hardware phones, that you may run into some issues if you're trying to use the older firmware migration technique with a transitional load. So two good examples as of the recording of this video that you would run into issues if you tried using the transitional firmware migration methodology, the older method, where it's basically step one, enterprise firmware to transitional firmware, and then from transitional to 3PCC. Well, you would run into an issue because with hardware versions 18 and 20, so these are the 7821 phones, the 7841 phones, and the 7861 phones, the transitional firmware does not know those phones because those phones were created after the firmware was created for the transitional firmware. So again, the technique you would want to use is what we're showing in this video to bypass the transitional firmware by going directly from 14.1.1 to MPP firmware. In this video, I'm going to be showing firmware 11.3.6. And at the time you view this video, definitely want to view the most current information regarding the phone hardware compatibility and the different versions of firmware, and this can be found at the link right here. Okay, another consideration is if you have really old phones. So again, looking at the 7821, 7841, 7861, the phones need to be a minimum. So for example, 7821, they need to be version 3 or later hardware. 7841, version 4 or later hardware. 7861, version 3 or later hardware. Otherwise, the firmware migration for those phones is not supported. Simply the hardware doesn't support the firmware migration. And this information is pulled directly from this white paper right here. So at the time you're viewing this video, you probably want to go ahead and take a look at this white paper just to understand what the current state is as far as what hardware is eligible for the firmware migration. Okay, for our setup today, it's pretty basic. I'm just using a Windows computer running a local TFTP server. It's going to be at 192.168.2.10. I have a phone here. It's set for as a DHCP client. Nothing special. The phone has version 14.1.1 enterprise firmware. I have another video. I'll put a link in the description below that shows you how to upgrade from older enterprise firmware to newer enterprise firmware if you don't have CUCM Call Manager on-site, Unified Call Manager. It's very similar to what we're going to be doing here in this video, but again, since I already have another dedicated video to show that process, I'll just put a link. If you need to do that, you can just view the video. You'll notice it's fairly straightforward. And well, basically, the two key items as far as what we're going to have on the TFTP server is there's going to be an XML file, and this is what actually instructs the phone. So when the phone goes and boots, it's going to be looking at the TFTP server, so 192.168.2.10, and one of the default files that the firmware on the phone has to actually pull down from a TFTP server is this XML default.cnf.xml file. And within that file, we're going to instruct the phone to go ahead and download this file that ends with .loads. And then this file is kind of like a directory or manifest. It's going to tell the phone all the other binaries that it needs to download. These are basically signed binaries, the firmware the phone uses. And so that's kind of how the mechanism works. Once you've done this, you'll notice it's actually very efficient, not that difficult. The first time you do it, it's maybe a tad different than things you've done in the past, but it tends to be very efficient. The other benefit is, since this is on your local LAN, it's using clear text. So if there's any issues you're running into, it's very easily to see within the log of the TFTP server. Or if you run Wireshark on a computer that's running TFTP, we can look at the payload of the packets and figure out, is the phone complaining about something? Is the phone not finding the specific XML file or the binaries it's looking for? Is the phone even reaching the TFTP server? Is the TFTP server responding back to the phone? So troubleshooting tends to be a lot easier, because one of the things that's a challenge is when you're doing firmware migrations directly to the cloud, even though it's using TFTP, the traffic's actually encrypted, so you can't really look at the payload, and it tends to be a little bit more tricky to diagnose exactly what's happening. So if you're having issues trying to do firmware migrations 100% through the cloud, this may be a good alternative because you have a lot more visibility and control by using a local TFTP server. Okay, and then within the actual XML default.cnf file, the key thing we're going to modify is the phone we're going to be using today is a speakerphone 8832, and basically we're going to find this .loads file. We're going to copy the file name. We don't need to copy the extension .loads. We just need to copy the file name, and then just basically make sure for that specific phone we paste that file name right in here between the greater than and less than symbol within this XML file. Then we're going to basically save that file, and then again, this is located within our root of our TFTP folder on our TFTP server. So when the phone boots and it does a handshake with the TFTP phone, with the TFTP server, it's going to pull this from the default to the root folder, and then this is going to now instruct the phone to pull down this .loads file. And once the phone pulls down the .loads file, then it's going to know or have instructions what signed binaries it needs to pull down for the firmware migration. And by the way, this XML default.cnf file was sourced from CUCM. At the end of the video, I will actually show the full contents of this file in case you don't have access to get this from CUCM and you want to generate it from scratch. Okay, for the TFTP server, we're just going to be using TFTPD64. This is very easy TFTP app to use. And basically, we want to make sure the root folder of the TFTP server is pointing to the folder where we have all the binaries for the 3PCC firmware. So that's basically, I have it on my desktop. I have the TFTP folder and then a child subfolder, and I'm just calling it whatever the binary is. And then within that, so this is going to be our root folder for the TFTP server. I make sure we have the xml.default.cnf file. And then we have all the binaries. And again, this is the key file right here. We're going to make sure we have within the xml.default file, since that's going to instruct the phone what to do. And then next, the only thing we need to do now is we're going to go on the phone telephony user interface, and we're going to go ahead and go into settings, then admin settings, network setup, Ethernet setup, IPv4, and then we're going to scroll down this menu kind of towards the middle bottom. There'll be an option for alternate TFTP. We're going to make sure we turn it on, and that's kind of what you see right here. So alternate TFTP, which is option 8 in this menu. We're going to make sure we turn on. As soon as we do that, the line right below that for TFTP server 1, it'll actually light up and it'll give us a field here where we can actually type in a number. So the local TFTP PC is going to be, in this case, 192.168.2.10. We then simply hit apply, and then we wait a few moments. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at it right now. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the configuration we need to do with the XML file. So we just copy the .loads file name. We're going to find the 8832 phone, since that's the phone we're going to be migrating from Enterprise to 3PCC. I'm going to paste the actual file name. I actually had it from before, but we'll kind of do this pretending that we did not have that before. Okay, now we've updated the XML file. Next thing we want to do is we want to point to the actual folder where we have the binaries and also the XML file to make it the root folder on our TFTP. Okay, we're going to go now on the phone settings. We're going to check the phone before we migrate it to see what it has. Okay, it has the SIP 8832 Enterprise Firmware 14.1.1. Okay, admin settings, network setup, Ethernet setup, IPv4 setup. And then we're going to go down the list here until we get to the alternate TFTP on. And then for the TFTP server 1, 192.168.2.10, and then we're going to hit apply. And this may take a few moments for the phone to actually start fetching, but generally I would say within 30 seconds to a minute or so is you should see some activity for the, okay, there we go, it's fetching the files now. If, let's say a couple minutes passes by, like 2 minutes plus, and there's no activity, definitely want to verify, you know, is the phone reachable? So try to ping the phone from the TFTP server. Make sure the TFTP server doesn't have any Windows firewall or third-party firewall or security enabled. That is one area that commonly folks may get tripped up, security blocking TFTP traffic. And generally this process takes roughly about 5 minutes for the firmware to be ingested by the phone. Once the phone ingests the firmware, it will go ahead and reboot itself, and then it will come up into the runtime of the 3PCC software firmware. Again, just to reiterate, One of the things that I did, which I'm not showing right now because I did it earlier, was I created a virtual license via WebEx Calling Control Hub using the firmware migration tool within WebEx Calling Control Hub based upon the MAC address of the phone and the model of the phone. In this case, it's a 8832 IP phone, and it's associated to a specific user. That user already has a phone number and extension, so please be aware it does need that license. And also this phone does have internet access, because one of the things it did, it actually did a handshake with the WebEx Calling firmware migration server to validate the firmware licensing for the migration. So just be aware that the firmware migration, okay, so we'll take a look at the actual phone now. The firmware migration ingestion was just complete. Okay, the phone's going to restart here in X amount of seconds. But in any case, going back to the discussion, if this is for a firmware migration that is not for WebEx calling, and it's for a third-party SIP controller, then you need to purchase the actual firmware migration license per each phone. The chart we looked at earlier, based upon the white paper document for the firmware migration. So just be aware that although we're going through this quite quickly, and as you notice, it's fairly good performance as far as the firmware migration we can achieve, especially if we're doing a large quantity of phones. But just keep in mind, you first want to prep the firmware migration license on WebEx Calling Control Hub. Okay, the phone just rebooted here. This may take a few minutes. Generally what happens is when it first boots up, the phone will go ahead and do a handshake with WebEx Calling server. Based upon the MAC address of the actual phone, it's going to check it to see if it has a profile that's being pre-configured. In this case it does, because part of the firmware migration license tool, when you go through that, is uploading a CSV file based upon the MAC address of the phone and also what user profile you want to attach it to. In any case, let's check to see what version the phone currently has while we're waiting. Okay, so it's 3PCC 11.3.6. Okay, so it's been migrated. So now we just have to wait until it finishes the handshake. Oh, okay. It just finished the handshake with the WebEx Calling server. It went ahead, downloaded the extension 1225. The phone number at the top, we'll check. Yeah, we have dial tone, and we're pretty much in business with the phone. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the XML file now. This XML file was actually sourced from CUSM 14 version, and this is the XML default.cnf.xml file. So this is the actual file the phone in its firmware, enterprise firmware, has logic built in for one of the actual files for it to check by default on the TFTP server. Normally this would be CUSM. In this case we do not have CUSM. We're just using a local third-party generic TFTP server. But in any case, so earlier I showed the specific line I modified in this file is tied to the specific phone we're trying to migrate. It was the Cisco 8832. So basically, based on the binaries that we're migrating to, in this case it was 11-36, I just copied the name of the file from downloads, pasted it here. But in this video, I want to actually show the entire file. So let's go ahead and start off at the top here. And if you don't have this XML file, you can basically stop the video and regenerate it from scratch. So I'll just kind of go down the file here and I'll pause for a few seconds. And as I'm doing that, let me talk about some other considerations for the firmware migration. So in this case, we firmware migrated one phone from Enterprise 14.1.1 to 3PCC 11.3.6, which is what currently WebEx Calling is running online. As you notice, the firmware migration was actually fairly quick and fairly efficient. So one of the attractions of using this methodology, where we're doing the heavy lifting locally on the local LAN with a local TFTP server, is to minimize the WAN transactions so you can speed up the process, especially if you have a large fleet of phones that you're trying to migrate in a very short period of time. What I would recommend is first try a few phones, like 1 or 2 phones, to make sure the workflow works in your environment. There's no surprises or anything. And then as you're getting ready to do larger batches of phone, do it progressively. So if anything goes wrong, you don't have a massive issue in your hand. It's something within control. So maybe start off with 1 or 2 phones. Make sure they migrate through the register to WebEx Calling. You can make a call, you can receive a call, everything looks good. Then maybe go ahead and try to do 5 phones. And again, wait till the phone's complete. They migrate to MPP software. They register to WebEx Calling. Again, test the call, test the phones to make sure they can receive, send calls, make calls, I should say. And then progressively maybe increase to 10 phones and make sure that's successful. And again, you have to determine, how big of a batch of phones you want to do concurrently. If something does go wrong, do you have enough personnel physically at the site to go and perhaps reset the phones back to factory default and do troubleshooting? So basically, it's a component of your project. You want to do risk management assessment, and you want to progressively increase the size or the batches of phones you're migrating. But at the same time, you want to throttle yourself, put a high watermark where you don't want to exceed the number where it's such a big number. If something goes wrong, now you have trouble because you physically don't have enough personnel to troubleshoot the phone. So just keep that in mind. Keep it in balance, realistic. Okay, so I just went through the actual XML file. Hopefully this video helps you with the firmware migration process. Again, as of the recording of this video, this firmware is fairly new, 14.1.1 enterprise firmware. Please, when you're watching this video, make sure you read the documents online on the Cisco site, the release notes. Things may and do change over time, so that's your best approach, but hopefully this gives you some ideas as far as the firmware migration process that might help you speed up your firmware migration method and also minimize any type of issues you have. Thank you for watching and have a good migration. Thank you.